These are the Canary Islands. They are probably familiar to you as one of Spain's major tourist destinations. The subtropical climate keeps the islands warm all year round, and the largest island, Tenerife, is home to the third largest volcano on Earth, measured from the ocean floor, Mount Teide. Well, from today, you will start to know the Canary Islands for a new milestone, for being the first region to demonstrate massively against the sector that feeds it, tourism. You're looking at more than 200,000 people. That was the number of demonstrators who marched against tourism in April 2024. What were their demands? To stop the sector in its tracks. To stop the construction of hotels, commercial ports, infrastructure. They demand an urgent change of economic model. The Canary Islands owe 35% of their GDP and more than 40% of their jobs to tourism. With these figures, it's hard to understand why such a large part of society attacks its main economic engine. Nevertheless, there are important reasons behind all this. First of all, the Canary Islands are poor, very poor, at least in European terms, of course. Its GDP per capita is the third lowest in Spain. With 22,000 euros per capita, we're talking about a region that is 40% poorer than Madrid. The protesters are clear. Tourism is to blame. They argue that the money from outsiders does not stay on the islands, but is absorbed by large companies, and that the only thing that does remain are precarious jobs as waiters or hotel staff. We will elaborate on this later, but naturally, it's not the only complaint. Tourism is often understood as overcrowding. Visitors that clog the roads, that litter, that consume natural resources. And of course, this is a big problem for the Canary Islanders. Protesters complain about the lack of water, golf courses, swimming pools, and millions of thirsty visitors are leaving the community dry. After all, we're talking about small islands. There are no large rivers, no lakes. Water is usually extracted from underground aquifers, which, when depleted, leave everyone without supply. But as you can imagine, the problem is not just the water. In terms of energy, it's a very similar story. To give you an idea, the island of Fuerteventura single-handedly accounts for half of all blackouts that happen in the whole of Spain. In any case, if there is one reason, the real reason that has ignited this whole wave of protests, it's the rental market. Canarian residents are the ones who spend the most money on their rents in relation to their income. The Canary Islands have the fourth highest rental prices in Spain, but being the third poorest region, housing becomes a real drama. Once again, the blame is placed on tourists, and more specifically on vacation rentals such as Airbnbs, which allegedly leave the residents themselves without housing supply. So, Visualeconomik viewers, the questions are clear. Is tourism ruining the Canary Islands? Why is it the third poorest community in Spain? Could such an important sector for the local economy really be wiped out? Today on Visualeconomik, we'll tell you all about it. I am sorry, but from the outset, I have to say one thing. The Canary Islands do not have a problem with tourism. In fact, it's not even the most visited community in Spain. The Balearic Islands, for example, with islands such as Mallorca, Menorca, and Ibiza, practically double the tourism figures of the Canary Islands, both in terms of surface area and number of inhabitants. But there is more. The Balearic Islands receive almost all of their visitors only in the summer months. However, as the Canary Islands have a subtropical climate, the season is spread throughout the year, and congestion is lower. Conclusion? Well, in terms of supposed tourist overcrowding, the Balearic Islands beat the Canary Islands hands down, and the Balearic Islands are not so poor either. On the contrary, the Balearic Archipelago is one of the richest communities in Spain, surpassing even historical industrial regions, such as Asturias or Cantabria. Tourism does not necessarily mean poverty, and there is one example that makes this even clearer: New York. New York is one of the most visited cities in the world, but it is also one of the richest. Returning to the comparison with the Canary Islands, New York's tourist overcrowding in relation to its surface area is streaks ahead. It multiplies by 40 times the figure of the Canary Islands, although tourists in relation to the population is comparable. In short, tourism is far from being synonymous with poverty. In fact, it is often quite the opposite, a good opportunity to grow other industries. The arrival of tourists increases the number of museums, restaurants, infrastructure, and leisure services available. It makes the city practically an amusement park where boredom is impossible. The result? Well, many people who are not tourists, for example, engineers, doctors, and investors, see places like New York as a fantastic place to live. And do you know what? This is precisely what led Dubai, another of the richest and most touristy cities on the planet, to bet on this sector. Despite being mega wealthy, being in the Persian Gulf, and being an Arab monarchy, Dubai has almost no oil. It is true that the country it belongs to, the United Arab Emirates, does have dinosaur juice by the bucket load. But we are only talking about Dubai's wealth here. The question is, where does it come from? Well, in large part, from tourism. Some 20% of Dubai's GDP comes from tourism spending. We're talking about 20 times more than the 1% generated by oil. And trust me, this is no coincidence. Just a few decades ago, Dubai was an inhospitable wasteland with nothing to see or enjoy. Pure desert. But this man, Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum, or in English, the Emir of Dubai, designed a plan to change everything. The Burj Khalifa, the Palm Jumeirah, both were part of his huge strategy to turn Dubai into one of the most important tourist centers. The objective? To give the emirate a shining image. The Emir wanted many people to fall in love with the city through tourism. But above all, he sought to convince entrepreneurs, businessmen, and engineers that Dubai was one of the most attractive places to live. The rest is history. Today, Dubai is arguably the largest business center in the entire Middle East. Something which, by the way, leads us to the next question in the video. Check it out. This is Mecca, Saudi Arabia, and what you see is the street cooling system used for the hottest days. Yes, indeed, that is water. Fresh water. I know, you guys are freaking out, right? The Arabs may have a lot of oil, but water? They're in the middle of the desert. How can they waste it by literally throwing it in the street? But nothing could be further from the truth. Saudi Arabia is, with 20% of its total supply and 9 million cubic meters per day, the country that desalinates the most water on the planet. You know how it goes. If you don't have fresh water, get it from the sea. And this brings us back to the case of the Canary Islands. With the example of water, you will begin to see where the problem of tourism really lies. In the culture of not in my backyard. With a desalination system like the one in Saudi Arabia, in less than 2 weeks, the Canary Islands could produce all the water it consumes in an entire year. And that's not counting the fact that a good percentage of that water could be recycled for uses such as agriculture. The question is, why don't they do it? Why don't the Canary Islands extract water from the surrounding sea to cope with the demands of tourists? Well, in part, they do. The Canary Islands do have some desalination plants, but nowhere near enough to supply a larger demand. And why aren't they building more? We've already told you, the culture of not in my backyard.
The movement Salvar Chira Soria protests before the start of the works of the desalination plant in Gran Canaria.
There are always reasons to deny the construction of new projects when they are close to you. That it spoils the landscape, then it makes noise, that it's bad for the birds, that nuclear power plants are Chernobyl. In this case, it was the desalination plant's turn, and tomorrow it will be something else. That's the way it goes. But apart from those who say no to everything, others argue that desalinating water is very expensive, that it consumes a lot of energy, and that it would not be profitable. Even more so when the islands already have energy problems. So what exactly is the problem? Well, on the one hand, there is a massive amount of intervention in the water pricing system. The municipalities arbitrarily decide the tariffs, and that means that the price is not adjusted to supply and demand. Politicians have incentives to set a lower price than normal, a price that, if too low, does not allow desalination plants to be profitable. Not only that, but an artificially low price basically subsidizes water for tourists, who can get cheap water and waste it, as they're not having to pay its real cost. However, there's an even bigger problem in all this. Can you guess what? That's right, once again, not in my backyard. What you are looking at are offshore wind installations. Clean, abundant, and above all, a source of cheap energy. The Canary Islands have had several plans to build infrastructure like these, but as you can imagine, the protests came not far behind.
Canary, Asturian, and Galician fishermen announced protests against offshore wind energy. Protest in Tenerife against offshore wind.
Okay, no windmills in the sea because the fishermen protest. What about building them on land? No, far from it. They look too ugly and kill the seagulls. Well, what if instead of wind energy, you go solar? Are you crazy, Josh? Then where will the rabbits make their burrows? Seriously, where do you come up with this stuff? Well, okay, look. I already have the solution. Oil. See this here? This area is full of black gold. Dinosaur juice galore. The Canary Islands could start exploiting it and kill 3 birds with 1 stone. First, it would end the island's energy dependence. Second, there would be cheap energy for the desalination plants. And third, it could become the richest petro-archipelago in Europe, meaning they could abandon tourism as an economic engine and start living like Arab sheikhs. Unless, of course, the not in my backyard culture acts up again.
Canary Islands takes to the streets to protest against oil. Thousands of Canary Islanders in the streets turned down the search for oil in the islands.
Look, jokes aside, this is a serious problem. You can understand that on some islands, they don't want to extract oil because a spill could damage the landscape. So, what's the problem? As the Canary Islands have not wanted to take advantage of this opportunity, its neighbor, Morocco, has already begun oil extraction projects off the Canary coast.
Morocco finds a treasure of 1 billion barrels of oil near Canary Islands.
Now the Canary Islands is left without oil, but the danger of spills is the same, because Morocco is not going to be the least bit concerned about it. The conclusion? Well, decide for yourselves. But at this point, I'd like to ask you a question. Is the problem tourism, or is the problem a society that refuses to make the necessary investments or regulations to prosper? So far, we've only talked about water and energy, but there are similar issues with housing. Let's get to the key question. Why is housing so expensive in the Canary Islands? Many people think that it's due to tourism, but vacation homes account for only 4.5% of the total, and many of them are in tourist areas where residents do not usually live. How much could this affect the rental price? Well, the studies that exist indicate not too much. For example, in the case of Madrid, a study estimated that the adoption of Airbnb increased the price of rents by around 4%. However, throughout this debate, the good aspect of vacation rentals is often omitted. To begin with, many of the owners of vacation homes are typically the residents themselves, not the hotel chains or big developers. Therefore, the rental fee is money that goes directly into the pockets of the Canary Islanders. Meanwhile, there are also many studies that show that Airbnb tourists considerably increase consumption and local economic activity. For example, in this analysis by the Complutense University of Madrid, it was found that an increase of 10 Airbnb rooms translated into at least one new restaurant and 8 new jobs. And remember, we're talking about jobs related to tourism, because the new restaurant needs plumbers, architects, someone to develop its website. In other words, a lot of new economic activity is being developed. So, if tourism is not necessarily to blame for the high rental prices, what is the root cause? Well, here, we have to talk about population density. The Canary Islands have almost double the Spanish average. It is the community with the 3rd highest inhabitants per square meter after Madrid and the Basque country. Many people live on the islands, and providing a house to everyone is complicated. Even more so when we are talking about limited territories with little capacity for growth. But take note, it's not that it's impossible. This is the Haeundae Dusan Weave the Zenith in South Korea, a housing complex with more than 70 floors, capable of providing homes for nearly 6,000 people, complete with a cinema and even a supermarket inside the buildings. South Korea is one of the most densely populated countries in the world, and similar to the Canary Islands, its territory is also quite limited. So, how do they solve this problem? Instead of building wide, they build high. We are talking about impressive buildings that, on top of their usefulness, are worthy of admiration. Well, by building a couple of housing complexes in the main city, not exactly like those in South Korea, but half the size, without the need to fill the island with towers and without the need to build in beach areas, the housing supply could increase dramatically and rental prices would plummet. So why isn't it done? Well, first of all, because regulations don't allow it, with few exceptions. The maximum buildable height in Santa Cruz de Tenerife, for example, is 8 floors. That is 10% of the Weave the Zenith buildings in South Korea. Of course, one alternative could be to change the regulation, or to allow more exceptions. But once again, that would most likely mean more social protests, demonstrations against urbanism, and in favor of the environment. In short, a return to the culture of not in my backyard, which in turn leads us to the most important question of all. Is there an alternative economic model that would please everyone? Think about it. There are no economic models without costs. Let's say, for example, that the alternative is to turn the Canary Islands into an industrial region. Would there be no protests over chemical spills or factory emissions? What's more, in order to be an industrial hub, the islands will need huge ports, such as those of Cantabria or Bilbao. Wouldn't that damage the landscape and the ecosystem? Well, certainly much more than building desalination plants or high-rise buildings. Perhaps the alternative is to set up a financial and technological center in the Canary Islands. But for that, programmers, economists, and qualified engineers would have to come from all over the world. The demand for housing would increase, and we would be in the same situation. In fact, some politicians have already proposed that the Canary Islands become a work center for digital nomads, such as programmers and designers. But as you can see, those of the not in my backyard culture have found problems even with that. question then is, how do the Canary Islanders actually want to make a living? And I'm serious. I would very much like to see Tenerife become a financial or technological super hub, and that's not going to happen without accepting the costs. The culture of not in my backyard wants to have the good without accepting the bad, and that is not how the economy works. If you want to earn money, you have to study, make an effort, and sacrifice your time. Just as if you want an economic model that generates more wealth, you will have to accept that infrastructure will be built and that investments will be made on new projects. And in the Canary Islands, it seems that every time you want to implement a project such as a commercial port, a hotel that brings people with money, or housing construction, the culture of not in my backyard is always present. But on top of that, many people who typically ask for tourism to be curbed then ask for a strong state, high taxes, and regulations that in turn do not allow the development of new industries. Conclusion, you can't have it all at once. Visualeconomik community. All economic models have problems, but in the case of tourism, it is much easier to point the finger at the tourists as the cause of your poverty rather than the politicians who contribute to it. And remember, we are not saying here that the Canary Islands should not protect its environment, its modest architecture, or its fishing. We only say that if investment is blocked, you can't expect to be much richer or have low rental prices. Not with tourism, not with any other sector. And having said this, and as this is a very subjective question, it's now your turn. Do you think that the Canary Islands should be so protected from investment? Do you think that the problems of tourism would happen with any other type of economic model? What makes the Balearic Islands like Ibiza and Majorca so much wealthier than the Canary Islands, despite having similar models? Leave us your impressions in the comments and let's start a debate. If you found this video interesting, don't forget to like and subscribe to Visualeconomik. All the best, see you next time.